Senator Robert Hale's laptop died at 4:56 in the afternoon, 4 minutes before he was scheduled to deliver a keynote on education funding to a room of 300 people.
There you go.
And the
Just a
small,
gentle
specific
turn.
horror of it, the frozen screen, the spinning wheel that would not stop spinning, the entire text of a speech he had rehearsed, twice trapped behind a login prompt that refused to accept his password, turned his chief of staff's face the color of the coffee shop's paper cups. They were in the small cafe, attached to the convention center, the only quiet corner with an outlet, and every person on Robert Hale's staff was doing the same useless thing, staring at the frozen screen as if staring hard enough might fix it. Nobody had thought to bring a backup copy of the speech on paper. Nobody had thought in 11 years of Robert Hale's political career that they would need one. "Excuse me," a voice said. "Can I look at it?" The voice belonged to a boy who couldn't have been older than 16, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big with a faded logo from a thrift store rather than a brand, standing behind the cafe counter where he'd clearly been working the register a moment earlier. Robert's chief of staff, mid-panic, waved him off without really looking at him. The boy did not go away. "It's doing the boot loop thing," the boy said, nodding at the screen. "I can probably get you back in 90 seconds, maybe less, if you let me try before IT gets here, because by the time they show up you've lost your slot before we find out what happened in the next 90 seconds, and the question that followed it. We need a minute to understand who was standing behind that cafe counter and why he knew exactly what was wrong with the United States." Senator's laptop, before the senator's own staff, had figured out how to spell the error message. The boy's name was Julian Ferris. He was 16 years old, and he had lived in 6 different foster placements over the past 9 years since he was 7, when his mother's addiction finally cost her custody for good, and his father had never been in the picture at all. He worked the afternoon shift at the cafe 4 days a week for $11.75 an hour, on top of a full course load and honor roll grades, because his current foster stipend covered rent and food and almost nothing else. And if Julian wanted the one thing he actually cared about, a working laptop of his own, since the one issued through his school district's loaner program had a cracked screen and a battery that lasted 40 minutes, he was going to have to earn it himself. He had learned to fix computers the way he'd learned most things that mattered to him, by necessity and mostly alone. A youth shelter he'd stayed in briefly at age 12 had a back room with 4 donated broken laptops nobody had time to deal with, and a part-time volunteer named Mr. Osei who showed him, over 6 Saturdays, how a hard drive actually worked, how to diagnose a boot failure, how a machine that looked completely dead was very often just confused, not broken. Julian had taken that afternoon and turned it into 4 years of teaching himself everything else: forums, tutorials, second-hand manuals, a battered Chromebook he'd repaired and re-repaired until it functioned as his primary computer for 2 straight years. He wanted eventually to study computer engineering. He had already been accepted, provisionally, into a summer coding intensive he had no idea how he'd afford the deposit for. "Go ahead," Robert Holly said, mostly out of desperation, sliding the laptop toward the boy. "You've got 90 seconds before I lose my mind." Julian sat down, popped open the diagnostics menu with a keyboard shortcut that made the chief of staff's eyebrows go up, watched the boot sequence fail in exactly the pattern he expected, and rebooted into safe mode. "It's not the password," he said, half to himself, half to the room. "Your update installed a driver conflict, probably an overnight patch, and it's catching on the login screen before Windows can even get to the point of checking your password. I can force it to skip the failed driver and boot clean. You'll lose the update for now, but you'll get your speech back." He typed for a stretch that felt, to Robert Halley, considerably longer than 90 seconds, and was by the cafe's wall clock exactly 83. The screen blinked, resolved, and the familiar desktop loaded, the speech document sitting exactly where it had been left, untouched. The cafe went very quiet for a second. Then Robert Hale's chief of staff exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for 4 minutes. Which she had. "You just saved my entire afternoon," Robert said, looking at the boy properly for the first time. "What's your name?" "Julian." "Julian, that was remarkable. Where'd you learn to do that?" "Foster care shelter a few years back. Guy named Mr. Osei showed me the basics on some old, donated laptops. Taught myself the rest." Julian stood to go back behind the counter, then stopped, the way a person stops when they've decided, in the space of a breath, to spend something they usually keep carefully guarded. "Can I ask you something, Senator?" "Of course." "You voted against the Foster Youth Digital Access Act in March, Senate Bill 2214. It would have funded refurbished laptops and internet stipends for kids aging out of the system. I looked up the roll call because a kid at my shelter said his caseworker mentioned it might help us. Your name was on the no list." Julian's voice did not rise. It stayed level, the exact, careful level of someone who had rehearsed the question quietly, alone many times, and had genuinely not expected to ever get the chance to ask it out loud. "Why?" "Before we continue, if you believe that the people the system overlooks are often the ones who understand it most clearly, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Dailies, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again. Today. Robert Halley stood there in the cafe with his laptop working again and his speech 4 minutes away, and for the first time in longer than he could easily admit, he did not have a ready answer. He remembered the bill vaguely, a budget amendment tucked into a larger appropriations package, one of 40 votes he'd cast that week, flagged by his staff as a modest line item competing against larger priorities his committee chair had asked him to protect. He remembered voting no. He did not, if he was honest with himself standing in that cafe, remember why, beyond the fact that his chief of staff had recommended it as fiscally cautious, and he had trusted the recommendation the way he trusted most recommendations that didn't cross his desk with a face attached to them. "I don't have a good answer for you," Robert said finally. "I voted the way my staff advised on a bill I don't think I read past the summary. That's not an excuse. It's just true, and you deserve the true version instead of one that makes me look better." Julian nodded slowly, the way a person nods when an honest answer, even an unflattering one, is still better than the alternative he'd been braced for. "Most people just tell me it's complicated," he said. "It usually is complicated, but it's also not that complicated to a kid whose only laptop has a screen that cracks a little more every month." Robert looked at the boy for a long moment. and something in the exchange, a fixed laptop, a level voice, a question asked without flinching by someone who had every reason to expect being dismissed, landed. Somewhere Robert had not expected a coffee shop. Errand to reach that afternoon. "Can you stay another minute?" Robert asked. "I want to hear the rest of what you'd tell me." If the bill came back up, Julian's manager, watching from behind the register, waved him on. "Take the time. We'll cover it." And Julian sat back down, and for the 11 minutes before Robert Holly absolutely had to walk on stage, a United States senator listened to a 16-year-old foster kid explain, in exact and specific terms, what it actually costs a kid aging out of care to not have reliable internet access for job applications, for community college financial aid portals that only accepted online submissions, for the coding boot camp he'd been accepted into and couldn't afford the deposit for because his laptop couldn't run the required software reliably enough to even apply for the scholarship that would have covered it. Robert Holly gave his speech 4 minutes late that day, a fact his staff would remember far longer than anyone in the audience did. 2 weeks later, his office reintroduced an amended version of the Foster Youth Digital Access Act as a co-sponsor, this time having actually read the full bill text himself and asked Julian, with his current foster parents' permission, and a modest honorarium that went straight into Julian's coding boot camp deposit, to testify before the committee about what the funding gap actually looked like from inside it. Julian testified for 6 minutes, level and unshaken. The same voice he'd used in the cafe, and the amended bill passed committee by a wider margin than the original version had ever managed on the floor. Robert Holly also did something he told almost no one about, because it wasn't the kind of thing he wanted attached to a press release. He personally covered the remaining cost of Julian's summer coding intensive, on the condition that Julian never mention where the money came from, because, as Robert told him quietly in the hallway after the hearing, "This isn't a favor I want credit for. It's a debt I only just realized I owed." Julian kept the fixed laptop, his own by then, purchased that summer with his first boot camp stipend, with a small strip of masking tape on the underside where he'd written, in permanent marker, the date of the day in the cafe, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that a 90-second fix and one honest question had done more for him than 4 years of forms and caseworkers ever had. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, is there a question you've been waiting for the chance to ask someone with more power than you?